What if everything you thought was secure, your culture, your community, your future, was being quietly erased? The Great Replacement Theory claims that this is not just a conspiracy, it's actually happening, and you're the target. Are you ready to uncover the truth behind the fear, the facts, and the forces shaping your world? Chapter 1. Seeds of Fear. The Great Replacement Theory. Its very name conjures images of shadowy forces at work, a calculated agenda to shift the demographic balance of entire nations. To its believers, the concept is simple, yet terrifying. A deliberate, orchestrated effort to replace the native populations of Western nations with immigrants from different racial and cultural backgrounds. For them, this isn't just a theory, but a reality unfolding before their eyes, a silent invasion that threatens to wipe away everything they hold dear. But where did this fear begin? The roots of the Great Replacement Theory reach deep into history, tapping into a timeless anxiety that societies have long faced when encountering the other. The modern version of this fear, however, took shape in the early 20th century, gaining traction in Europe and later spreading to the United States and beyond. Proponents trace the theory back to the collapse of empires, particularly pointing to how demographic shifts contributed to the fall of great civilizations. For many believers, the Roman Empire serves as a powerful example. They recount how waves of barbarian invasions, Goths, Vandals, and Huns, gradually chipped away at Rome's once mighty foundations. These invaders, they argue, weren't just enemies on the battlefield, but represented a deeper, more insidious change: the erosion of Roman culture, values, and identity. The parallels drawn are stark. Just as Rome was overwhelmed by foreign forces, they believe modern Western nations are being slowly overwhelmed by immigrants, whose cultures and traditions will eventually replace the old ways. Flash forward to more recent history, and the narrative grows darker. Believers of the Great Replacement Theory often point to the mass migrations following World War II as a critical turning point. Europe, war-torn and desperate for reconstruction, opened its doors to immigrants from former colonies, Algeria, Pakistan, and India, to name a few. To the economic planners of the time, these new arrivals were seen as essential to rebuilding shattered infrastructure. But to some segments of the population, they represented the first cracks in the national fabric. In France, for example, the influx of Algerian immigrants in the 1960s sparked fears of an Islamic takeover. To the everyday Frenchman, this wasn't just about job competition or strained public services. It was about something more existential: the fear that French culture, defined by its language, Catholic roots, and secular values, was under threat. Those early fears took root, especially among far-right intellectuals and political figures who began voicing concerns that France was losing its soul to foreign influence. Jean Raspail's infamous 1973 novel, The Camp of the Saints, captured this growing unease. The book, considered by many as the ideological blueprint for the Great Replacement Theory, depicts a dystopian future in which France is overrun by masses of impoverished immigrants from the global south. Its vivid imagery of cultural destruction and demographic collapse resonated with those who already feared that their country was on a similar path. To its believers, the Camp of the Saints wasn't just fiction, it was prophecy. For some, this fear of cultural annihilation was deeply personal. Take Michel, a 48-year-old former factory worker from the outskirts of Lyon, who vividly remembers when his once homogeneous, working-class neighborhood began to change. It was gradual at first, Michel recalls. New families moving in, different languages being spoken, different foods in the shops. But then, all of a sudden, it felt like I was living in a foreign country. The France I grew up in, it's gone. Michel's sentiments reflect a broader feeling of displacement shared by many who support the theory. The idea that their homeland is being slowly taken over by outsiders, transforming into something unrecognizable. These early adopters of the Great Replacement Theory often view demographic change not as an organic process, but as a deliberate plan orchestrated by powerful elites. They speak of politicians, corporations, and globalist organizations pushing policies that encourage immigration, multiculturalism, and open borders, all designed, in their view, to dilute the power of the native-born citizens. For them, The erosion of cultural heritage, language, and race isn't just a byproduct of globalization. It's the goal. As this fear spread, it gained traction beyond intellectual circles, finding resonance among ordinary people who saw themselves as on the front lines of a demographic shift. In the United States, the focus turned to the southern border, where waves of immigrants from Latin America were seen as evidence of a grander plan to transform the racial and cultural makeup of the country. "They're not just coming for jobs," said Robert, a small-town Texan who has lived near the border his entire life. "They're coming to change America, to replace us." Robert's fears are echoed by millions who believe that an unchecked influx of immigrants will eventually erase the values and traditions that define their country. But it's not just the working class who see the Great Replacement theory as a looming reality. In recent years, more and more middle-class professionals have started to echo these concerns, citing cultural changes in schools, media, and workplaces as signs of an impending shift. For Emily, a marketing executive in London, it's the normalization of diversity that alarms her most. "Every TV show, every ad, it's all about diversity now," she says. "It's like they're trying to condition us to accept that the Britain we knew is gone." From the perspective of the believers, the erosion is already well underway. The cities they once knew have become unrecognizable, filled with new languages, new faces, and new customs. To them, the cultural symbols they grew up with, flags, traditions, even the national anthem, are being slowly replaced by multicultural values that, while celebrated by some, are seen as a death knell by others. The fear of being replaced is powerful. For those who subscribe to the Great Replacement theory, it is not just about numbers or immigration policies. It's about survival, the survival of their people, their culture, and their way of life. And to them, the stakes couldn't be higher. Chapter 2: The Messengers of Doom. The Great Replacement theory didn't spread in a vacuum. It wasn't just whispered over kitchen tables or shared in small, dark corners of the internet. It was amplified, weaponized, and given life by a host of charismatic leaders, media personalities, and intellectuals who became the messengers of doom, warning their audiences that the end of their way of life was near. These figures transformed what was once a fringe idea into a movement with mass appeal, one that shook the very foundations of national discourse. Their voices were loud, their messages urgent, and their reach vast. At the forefront of this charge was Renaud Camus, a French writer and polemicist whose 2011 book, Le Grand Remplacement, gave the theory its modern name. Camus' vision was bleak. Europe, he claimed, was undergoing a calculated replacement of its native population by immigrants from Africa and the Middle East. For Camus, this wasn't just an accident of globalization. It was a deliberate conspiracy orchestrated by political elites. His words struck a nerve with those who already felt the creeping anxiety of demographic change. And soon his theory spread like wildfire, picked up by far-right circles across Europe. But Camus wasn't a bombastic, rabble-rousing figure. He was a quiet intellectual, a man who could appear more like a scholar than a provocateur. Yet his ideas resonated far beyond academic circles, thanks in part to the media personalities who took up his cause. One such figure was Eric Zemmour, a French journalist and commentator whose inflammatory rhetoric on immigration and identity issues made him a household name. Zemmour took Camus' ideas and gave them mass appeal, using his platform on primetime TV shows to deliver dire warnings about the future of France. His tone was always urgent, filled with apocalyptic imagery of a nation on the brink of collapse. "France is being invaded," he would say, staring directly into the camera, his voice grave. "The country we know, the culture we cherish, will be gone if we don't act now." His words sent shockwaves through the French public, galvanizing a growing number of people who already felt alienated by the changes they were seeing in their towns and cities. The message was clear: time was running out, and if they didn't push back, they would be replaced. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, similar voices were rising, each with their own twist on the narrative. Tucker Carlson, a prominent figure on Fox News, became one of the loudest proponents of the Great Replacement theory, albeit in a more coded form. With his nightly monologues, Carlson spoke of a planned demographic shift that was designed to strip native-born Americans of their power. He didn't have to say replacement outright. His viewers understood the implications. The genius of Carlson's method was in how he blended paranoia with a veneer of respectability. He didn't shout or rant. He calmly, methodically laid out what he presented as indisputable facts, framing immigration as a plot orchestrated by liberal elites to dilute the power of real Americans. Carlson's influence was massive. His segments were clipped and shared millions of times across social media, spreading far beyond his television audience. What was once confined to conspiracy forums now reached the mainstream, and suddenly, the Great Replacement Theory was part of the national conversation. But the real masters of spreading the theory were those who understood the power of new media, viral speeches, documentaries, and social media platforms that allowed for rapid dissemination of ideas. Take, for example, the documentary The Great Replacement, Europe's Silent Invasion, a conspiracy-laden film that painted a dystopian future where Europe was overrun by immigrants. The film's use of dramatic music, dark visuals, and cherry-picked statistics created a sense of impending doom, playing directly into the fears of its viewers. It spread like wildfire online, shared on platforms like YouTube and Facebook, where it racked up millions of views. The film's creators understood something fundamental. Fear is contagious, and when packaged correctly, it spreads faster than wildfire. Clips from the documentary were turned into memes, quotes plastered over images of burning cities or hordes of immigrants marching through European streets. These images were designed to provoke an emotional response, to bypass logic and go straight to the heart of the viewer's deepest fears. And it worked. Across Europe and North America, the narrative of an impending replacement took root in the minds of millions. Behind the scenes, the people who propagated these ideas were well aware of the power they wielded. They weren't just spreading a theory, they were creating a movement. Far-right leaders like Marine Le Pen in France and Viktor Orban in Hungary seized on the Great Replacement narrative, using it to fuel their political ambitions. They held rallies where thousands of people gathered, waving flags and chanting slogans about saving their nation from the invaders. These rallies weren't just political events. They were spectacles of fear, designed to stoke paranoia and rally support against the supposed existential threat posed by immigration. But for every rally, every viral video, there were also those who sought to counter the narrative. Intellectuals, journalists, and politicians on the left mounted efforts to debunk the theory, pointing out that immigration was not a conspiracy, but a natural consequence of globalization. They highlighted the economic benefits of immigration and called for compassion and integration rather than fear and division. Yet, to the believers of the Great Replacement theory, these efforts only confirmed their suspicions. The opposition, they believed, was part of the very conspiracy they feared. Figures like Camus and Zemmour became heroes of the movement precisely because they were willing to speak the truth that others wouldn't. And the more the opposition pushed back, the more their supporters saw them as martyrs in the fight for their nation's survival. To the believers, the counter-efforts weren't an attempt to bring reason to the debate. They were evidence of the elites trying to suppress the truth. Chapter 3. Numbers don't lie, or do they? The believers of the Great Replacement theory don't just rely on fear and speculation. They turn to numbers, cold, hard data, to prove their case. For them, the statistics are undeniable, irrefutable proof that their nations are being transformed before their very eyes. And it's not just a feeling anymore. They believe the numbers are screaming it. Population growth charts, birth rates, and migration figures are their weapons of choice, and they wield them like seasoned generals leading their armies into battle. The data is clear to them. Native populations are shrinking, while immigrant numbers are exploding. It's simple math, they argue, and the outcome is inevitable replacement. In France, where the Great Replacement theory has deep roots, believers frequently point to birth rate disparities. They'll cite that the native French population, largely white and secular, has a birth rate of around 1.8 children per woman, below the replacement rate of 2.1 needed to sustain a population. By contrast, they argue the birth rates of immigrant families, particularly those from North Africa and the Middle East, are significantly higher, averaging over 3 children per woman. To believers, this isn't just a cultural shift, it's a ticking time bomb. Pierre, a retiree living in the suburbs of Paris, explains it in no uncertain terms. Everywhere I go, I see more and more veils, more and more faces I don't recognize, he says, frustration etched on his face. I've lived here my whole life, and I barely recognize my own neighborhood. The French people, our culture, it's being replaced slowly, maybe, but surely. For Pierre and millions like him, the changes they witness in their communities feel undeniable. It's not just a vague sense of discomfort, it's reinforced by the numbers. In their minds, they can almost see the replacement happening. Families from foreign backgrounds moving into their towns, their children filling the local schools, their languages replacing French in public spaces. To them, the statistics provide a lens through which they view the world. These numbers seem to confirm their worst fears, and the pace of change feels rapid, unstoppable. Across the Atlantic, the same narrative plays out in the United States. Proponents of the Great Replacement theory frequently cite the changing demographics of the country as evidence that they are being pushed aside. In 1965, they point out the U.S. was over 85% white. But by 2045, according to Census Bureau projections, white Americans are expected to make up less than 50% of the population. We're becoming a minority in our own country, they'll say, with a mix of anger and disbelief. Stephen, a 35-year-old factory worker from Pennsylvania, feels like he's watching his community vanish. 10 years ago, you didn't see this many people speaking Spanish in town. Now it's like half the shops have signs in a language I don't even understand. It's like we don't matter anymore, like we're being pushed out, he says, his voice tight with resentment. And it's not just here, it's happening all over the country. Look at the numbers. We're being replaced. To people like Stephen, the numbers aren't just academic, they're deeply personal. Each statistic represents a piece of their life that they feel is slipping away. They'll point to reports showing that over 1 million immigrants enter the U.S. legally each year, with millions more crossing the border illegally. They'll talk about declining white birth rates, rising minority populations, and the fact that non-whites now make up a majority of children under the age of 10 in many states. The narrative is always the same. Native populations are shrinking, while immigrant numbers swell. It's happening faster than anyone predicted, they'll say, and the powers that be are doing nothing to stop it. In fact, they believe the elites are encouraging it. But critics argue that the believers of the Great Replacement theory are misinterpreting, or worse, manipulating the data. Yes, it's true that demographics are changing, they say, but these shifts are part of broader social and economic trends, not the result of a sinister plot to replace native populations. Take birth rates, for example. Critics point out that while immigrants may have higher birth rates upon arrival, those rates tend to fall in line with the native population within 1 or 2 generations. The idea that immigrant populations will continue to have high birth rates forever is a myth, says Dr. Caroline Martinez, a demographer who has studied population trends in Europe. What we see time and again is that as immigrant families settle into their new countries, their birth rates tend to mirror those of the host population. The idea of a population explosion simply doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Similarly, on the issue of migration, critics emphasize that immigrants don't simply replace native populations. Rather, they contribute to the economy, pay taxes, and help fill labor shortages in crucial sectors. Without immigration, they argue, many Western nations would face economic decline due to aging populations and shrinking workforces. But for the believers, these arguments fall on deaf ears. They see them as nothing more than deflections, excuses made by those who are complicit in the replacement. Of course they're going to say that, says Frank, a former small business owner from Arizona. They don't want us to know what's really going on. But the numbers don't lie. Just look at how our towns are changing. It's happening right in front of us. This sense of vindication grows stronger with each passing year. As the statistics continue to show shifting demographics, the believers feel more entrenched in their views. For them, the numbers aren't just projections or abstract data points. They're proof that their way of life is slipping away, one birth, one migrant, one policy decision at a time. And as their certainty hardens, so too does their resolve. They look around at their changing communities, at the rising number of immigrants in their workplaces, their schools, their towns, and they see the evidence everywhere. The numbers they believe are not just numbers, they are the future, a future in which they are gradually, inexorably replaced. In the end, the debate over the numbers becomes less about facts and more about feelings, about who gets to define what's happening and who has the right to claim the future. For the believers, the numbers are a warning, a rallying cry to protect what they hold dear before it's too late. But for the critics, the statistics tell a different story, one of progress, diversity, and change. It's a battle not just over the present, but over the future itself. And the numbers, whether manipulated or not, have become the ammunition in this growing war of perception. Chapter 4: Global Elite or Shadow Puppet Masters. The believers of the Great Replacement Theory don't just see demographic shifts as a natural consequence of global migration. No, in their eyes, this is something much darker, something far more calculated. They are convinced that behind the scenes, a global elite, shadowy puppet masters, are pulling the strings, orchestrating the deliberate replacement of native populations in the West. These powerful figures, believers claim, are working in secret, plotting to reshape nations for their own benefit. It's a thrilling and terrifying narrative, one that draws on centuries-old fears of hidden forces manipulating the fate of the world. The players are familiar: international bankers, tech moguls, politicians, and philanthropists. To believers, these aren't just the wealthy or influential. They're the architects of a sinister agenda. And in their minds, the pieces all fit. For example, take the infamous Bilderberg meetings, an annual event where the world's most powerful business leaders, politicians, and thinkers gather behind closed doors to discuss global policy. It's invitation only, and the details of what's discussed remain shrouded in secrecy. For most, it's just a high-level networking event, but for the followers of the Great Replacement Theory, it's something far more sinister. This is where the elites, they claim, plot their strategies to ensure the continuing erosion of Western identities. In the imagination of believers, these meetings are filled with secretive exchanges, hushed conversations between politicians and billionaires about how to weaken national borders, how to promote multiculturalism, and how to flood Western nations with immigrants. In darkened rooms, far from the eyes of the public, decisions are made that will affect the fate of millions. These meetings, they say, are not just gatherings of world leaders. They are the puppet masters pulling the strings, ensuring that their globalist vision is realized. The idea that the world is controlled by a small, shadowy elite is not new. But in the context of the Great Replacement Theory, it takes on a chilling new dimension. These elites, believers argue, are deliberately engineering population shifts through policies like open borders, the promotion of multiculturalism, and globalism. They are doing this to weaken national identities, erode cultural heritage, and ultimately create a more homogenized, controllable world where power is concentrated in the hands of the few. For these believers, open borders aren't just about humanitarianism or economic necessity. They are part of a larger plan. The influx of immigrants, they argue, isn't a natural response to war or poverty. It's a tool used by the elites to dilute the power of native populations. By flooding Western countries with migrants, the elites are creating a more fragmented, less cohesive society, one that is easier to control. Why else, they ask, would leaders allow such massive migration? To the believers, the answer is simple. It's all part of the plan. Look no further than the 2015 European migrant crisis, when millions of refugees from the Middle East and Africa poured into Europe. For many, this was a humanitarian disaster, a consequence of war and instability. But for believers in the Great Replacement Theory, it was something else, a deliberate move by the elites to weaken European nations. They point to political figures like Angela Merkel, Germany's former chancellor, who opened her country's borders to over 1 million refugees. In the eyes of believers, Merkel wasn't acting out of compassion. She was following the orders of the global elite, who saw the migrant crisis as an opportunity to accelerate the replacement of native Europeans. The theory gains further traction through conspiracy-laden documentaries and viral videos, which often depict shadowy meetings and financial transactions as evidence of this grand design. These videos are skillfully edited to weave together real-world political events with dark theories about global manipulation. A prominent one among them is George Soros, a billionaire philanthropist who has become a central figure in these conspiracy theories. Soros, through his Open Society foundations, has advocated for human rights and democratic governance, but for the believers, he is the ultimate villain, the man funding the destruction of national borders, pouring money into pro-immigration groups, and ensuring that Western nations are overrun. To the believers, Soros isn't just one man. He is the face of a globalist conspiracy backed by untold wealth and power. They point to the fact that his foundation has spent billions on initiatives that support immigration, refugees, and minority rights as proof of his role in the plot. For them, his financial involvement isn't about promoting democracy or protecting human rights. It's about ensuring that the replacement continues unabated. In their minds, these political figures are working hand in hand with tech giants and media moguls to ensure that the public is kept distracted, misinformed, and unaware of what's really happening. They believe that globalist agendas are promoted through Hollywood, the tech industry, and social media platforms, all of which are controlled by the same elite forces. They want us to accept multiculturalism, they'll say, because it makes us easier to control. If we don't know who we are, if we're divided, we're easier to rule. But not everyone buys into this dark narrative. Critics argue that the global elite conspiracy is nothing more than a convenient scapegoat for complex social and economic issues. Dr. Jessica Howard, a sociologist at Harvard, argues that what believers interpret as deliberate population engineering is actually the result of systemic inequality and globalization. The idea that there's some grand conspiracy behind migration is ridiculous, she says. What we're seeing is the result of centuries of inequality, war, and economic hardship. Migration has always been a part of human history, and the idea that it's being orchestrated by a handful of elites is a gross oversimplification. Howard also points out that the rise of globalism, trade, international cooperation, and cultural exchange is not a coordinated effort to destroy national identities, but a natural consequence of an interconnected world. People move, she says. Borders shift. Cultures change. It's not a conspiracy, it's history. However, for believers in the Great Replacement theory, these arguments only serve to strengthen their resolve. They see the critics as part of the cover-up, as complicit in the grand plan to hide the truth. Of course they're going to say that, one believer says. They don't want us to know what's really going on, but we see through it. We know what's happening. Chapter 5, The Battlefield of Nations. The Great Replacement theory is not just an abstract idea discussed in online forums or whispered among conspiracy theorists. For believers, it is unfolding in real time on the streets of their cities, in their schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods. They see it happening all around them, an invasion by stealth, with borders ignored and cultures eroded. Nowhere is this more visible, they say, than in the heartlands of the West. And the battlegrounds are clear. France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States, nations once proud of their identities, but now, in the eyes of believers, being lost to mass immigration. In France, the birthplace of the Great Replacement theory, the tension is palpable. For years, the country has grappled with rising immigration, particularly from North Africa and the Middle East. Believers often point to the suburbs of Paris, known as the banlieues, where large numbers of immigrants live, as evidence of the replacement in action. They see these neighborhoods as no-go zones, places where French culture no longer exists and where the values of the Republic are forgotten. Sophie, a 42-year-old teacher from Marseille, watches these changes with a growing sense of dread. It's not the France I grew up in, she says, her voice heavy with frustration. I see the veils. I hear the foreign languages. We are losing what it means to be French. For Sophie and others like her, the changes aren't just superficial. They represent a deeper erosion of national identity. She remembers the protests that rocked France in 2018, when President Emmanuel Macron faced fierce opposition from the Yellow Vest movement. Though initially about fuel taxes, the protests quickly spiraled into a larger expression of anger at the government's immigration policies and what many saw as the abandonment of the native French working class. To believers, it was a cry of resistance, a sign that people were waking up to the replacement happening in their country. The 2022 presidential election only intensified these fears. Far-right candidate Marine Le Pen, running on an anti-immigration platform, reached the second round of voting. Although she ultimately lost to Macron, her near victory was seen as a warning. The French people were no longer willing to sit idly by while their country was, in their eyes, transformed by foreign influences. In Germany, the situation feels even more charged. The memories of World War II and the Holocaust still loom large over the country. And for years, Germany has worked to atone for its dark past by embracing multiculturalism and open borders. But that open-armed approach was tested in 2015, when Chancellor Angela Merkel made the controversial decision to admit over 1 million refugees, primarily from Syria and Afghanistan. To many Germans, it was a humanitarian act. To believers in the Great Replacement, it was the beginning of the end. Klaus, a 58-year-old factory worker from Dresden, remembers the moment clearly. We were told it was temporary, that these people would integrate and become part of Germany, he says, shaking his head. But they don't want to be German. They want to bring their own cultures here, and we're the ones who have to adapt. Klaus speaks for many in the former East Germany, where economic hardship has mixed with a fear of cultural replacement. The rise of the far-right Alternative for Germany party has capitalized on this fear. The AfD, once a fringe group, surged in the polls after Merkel's refugee policy, winning seats in the Bundestag and becoming the largest opposition party by 2017. Their message is clear: Germany is under threat, and only they can stop the replacement. In cities like Chemnitz, protests have turned violent. Riots broke out in 2018 after a German man was killed by 2 asylum seekers, fueling anger and sparking demonstrations. The streets filled with thousands of people, chanting anti-immigration slogans and waving German flags. For the believers, it was a sign that the fight was far from over. Across the English Channel, the United Kingdom has its own battle to fight. The country's decision to leave the European Union in 2016, Brexit, was driven, in large part, by fears over immigration. Nigel Farage, the charismatic leader of the UK Independence Party, became the face of the movement, stoking fears of uncontrolled immigration and the loss of British sovereignty. For believers in the Great Replacement, Brexit was a victory. It was proof that the people could rise up and take back control of their borders. We were being overrun, says John, a 52-year-old construction worker from Birmingham. Every year, more people coming in, taking jobs, changing our communities. Brexit was about stopping that, about saying enough is enough. Johnstown, like many others in the Midlands, has seen significant demographic changes over the past 2 decades. He recalls how, when he was a child, his neighborhood was almost entirely white British. Now he says it feels foreign. You walk down the street, and it's like you're in another country. And it's not just about race, it's about culture. We're losing who we are. And then there's the United States, where the battle over immigration is perhaps the most visible and politically charged. The 2016 election of Donald Trump was, for many believers, a sign that their message was finally being heard. Build the wall, they chanted at rallies, echoing Trump's promise to stop all illegal immigration from Mexico and other Latin American countries. For believers like Lisa, a 40-year-old mother from Texas, the wall wasn't just about security, it was about survival. Our towns are changing, she says. You see it everywhere, people coming in, not speaking English, not wanting to become American. It's like they're bringing their countries here. Lisa lives in a small town near the border, where the population has shifted dramatically over the years. She remembers when her children's school was almost entirely white. Now she says her kids are in the minority. It's not about being racist, she insists. It's about wanting to keep our country the way it is. If we don't do something, we're going to lose everything. Trump's presidency, with its focus on immigration and border security, was a rallying cry for believers in the Great Replacement theory. His administration's policies, banning immigration from certain Muslim-majority countries, ramping up deportations, and restricting refugee admissions, were seen as steps to stop the replacement. But for many, the battle is far from over. Even after Trump left office, the fear remains that the United States is being slowly, steadily changed. Critics of the Great Replacement theory argue that these fears are not based on reality, but are stoked by nationalist movements for political gain. What we're seeing is the exploitation of fear, says Dr. Richard Allen, a political scientist from Oxford. Immigration has always been part of the global landscape, but nationalist leaders are using it as a tool to divide people and create an us versus them mentality. According to Allen, the demographic changes in countries like France, Germany, the UK, and the US are not part of a grand conspiracy, but rather the result of globalization, conflict, and economic migration. The idea that native populations are being replaced is a gross oversimplification, he says. These movements are about power, not preservation. But for the believers, such arguments are nothing more than deflections. In their minds, the battlefield is real, the stakes are high, and their nations are on the brink. As they see it, they are the last line of defense in a war for the soul of their countries, and they are ready to fight. Chapter 6: Resistance and Retaliation. For some, the Great Replacement theory is not just an intellectual exercise or an abstract fear. It is a call to arms. As the narrative of demographic change deepens, so does the desperation felt by its believers. They no longer see themselves as passive witnesses to a shifting world. Instead, they view themselves as warriors fighting against the tide of destruction that they believe is swallowing their culture, their country, and their very existence. In their eyes, time is running out and drastic measures must be taken. This sense of urgency has sparked a rise in both movements and violence tied to the belief in the Great Replacement. What starts as a murmur of discontent can, in the minds of the most fervent believers, transform into something far more dangerous, a battle cry, a justification for retaliation. And in recent years, this shift has left a bloody trail across the globe. On a quiet Friday afternoon in March 2019, the world's attention turned to Christchurch, New Zealand, where a devastating act of violence would etch the Great Replacement theory into the global consciousness. Armed with semi-automatic rifles and streaming his actions live on social media, a 28-year-old man entered 2 mosques and opened fire. By the time the attack ended, 51 people lay dead and dozens more were injured. What set this attack apart from others wasn't just the scale of the violence. It was the chilling manifesto the gunman left behind. The document echoed the very fears that had taken root in far-right circles, that Western civilization was under attack by mass immigration, and that the white race was being deliberately replaced. For many believers, the Christchurch shooter was a martyr, someone who had taken the ultimate step in defending his people from extinction. But for the rest of the world, it was a terrifying wake-up call, a stark reminder of how dangerous the Great Replacement narrative could become when it crossed the line from fear to violence. What drives someone to cross that line? For some, it begins with a sense of helplessness, an overwhelming belief that their way of life is being destroyed, and that the government, the media, and society at large are complicit in this silent invasion. At first, they might engage in peaceful protests, attend rallies, or share their fears in online forums. But for others, the shift happens gradually, spurred on by a steady stream of incendiary rhetoric and conspiracy-laden content. Take the case of Patrick Crusius, the man responsible for the 2019 mass shooting at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, where 23 people were killed and dozens more injured. Like the Christchurch shooter, Crusius left behind a manifesto filled with references to the Great Replacement. He specifically targeted Latinos, whom he believed were part of the invasion of Texas. His manifesto warned of the Hispanic takeover and framed his attack as a defensive measure, a way to protect America from being overrun. These acts of violence are the tragic culmination of a dangerous belief system that pushes some believers from passive fear to active retaliation. In their minds, the time for peaceful resistance has passed. They see themselves as soldiers in an existential war, one that demands action, no matter how extreme. Not all believers take up arms, but the rise of far-right movements across Europe and the United States is a testament to the growing traction of the Great Replacement theory. Groups like Germany's Pegida and France's Generation Identity have mobilized thousands to protest against immigration and what they see as the erosion of their cultural heritage. These movements are often loud, provocative, and confrontational, with protests that escalate into clashes with police and counter-protesters. In France, a country where the Great Replacement theory first took root, far-right protests have erupted in response to everything from government immigration policies to the increasing visibility of Islam in public life. The tension reached a boiling point in 2021 when thousands of people gathered in Paris, waving French flags and chanting slogans against the invasion. For many in attendance, these protests are about reclaiming their country, their culture, and their future. But within these movements, there is an undercurrent of something darker. The line between peaceful protest and violent action is a fragile one. And for some, the rhetoric of resistance can quickly turn into a call for retaliation. This is where the most radicalized elements come into play, those who believe that words and protests are no longer enough. The shift from fear to violence was most famously exemplified by Anders Breivik, the Norwegian far-right extremist who, in 2011, killed 77 people in a bomb and gun attack that shocked the world. Breivik's motivations were deeply rooted in his belief in the Great Replacement. In his own manifesto, Breivik described his actions as part of a larger war against Islam and multiculturalism, a war he believed was necessary to save Europe from being overrun. Breivik's attack was meticulously planned, and his manifesto revealed a man who saw himself as a soldier in a much larger conflict. He believed that his actions would inspire others to rise up and join the fight, to take back their countries from what he saw as the encroaching threat of immigration and cultural replacement. In the years since his attack, Breivik has become a symbol for far-right extremists across the world, further fueling the dangerous belief that violence is a legitimate form of resistance. Critics of the Great Replacement theory argue that these acts of violence are not the result of demographic changes, but of political opportunists who exploit fear for their own gain. Political scientist Dr. Sarah Collins points to how far-right leaders and media figures fan the flames of fear, stoking anxiety about immigration and demographic shifts in order to mobilize their base. What we're seeing, she says, is the weaponization of fear. People are being told that they are under siege and that the only solution is to fight back. According to Collins, the key to addressing these fears lies in dialogue, not division. Yes, countries are changing, and yes, immigration is a part of that. But rather than resorting to violence or scapegoating certain groups, we need to have honest conversations about what that change looks like. We need to talk about integration, about cultural preservation, and about finding common ground. Chapter 7. A Future on the Edge. The world stands at a precipice. For those who believe in the Great Replacement theory, the future is a terrifying vision of societal collapse unless something is done, and done fast. They imagine a world where their nations no longer exist as they knew them, overrun by immigrants, their cultures erased, their identities lost. This is the nightmare that keeps them up at night, fueling their determination to act before it's too late. But what would that future really look like if the theory continues to grow in influence, driving policy and societal shifts? The answer is as chilling as it is uncertain. Imagine a world where the fears of the Great Replacement's believers have been realized, where fear of demographic change has become the driving force behind policy. In this future, the West has become a fortress with borders sealed tight, guarded by surveillance drones and militarized checkpoints. The once bustling airports and open highways now feel like relics of a distant past. International travel has become a privilege of the few, restricted by governments that no longer trust the outside world. Refugees and immigrants are no longer welcomed as they once were. They're turned away, their pleas for asylum ignored. The message is clear: you are not wanted here. In Europe, countries like France, Germany, and Italy have taken the most extreme measures, enforcing stringent birthright laws, banning the teaching of foreign languages in schools, and imposing heavy fines for any expression of cultural diversity. Citizens are required to carry identification that proves their national origin, and those unable to do so are marked for deportation. Mass purges have begun, with entire communities uprooted and forced into internment camps under the guise of cultural preservation. The believers, now in power, view this as the necessary price to pay for the survival of their way of life. In the United States, the border wall with Mexico has expanded higher, thicker, and now electrified. National Guard troops patrol cities with large immigrant populations, rounding up those deemed to be undocumented. New laws have been passed banning dual citizenship, and birthright citizenship is a thing of the past. In rural towns, armed militias take matters into their own hands, enforcing their own brand of vigilante justice on anyone they consider an outsider. Once vibrant communities have been hollowed out, divided by suspicion and hatred. For believers, this world represents a hard-won victory, the last stand against an existential threat. They see it as a return to national purity, a reclamation of their birthright. But even in their triumph, the consequences of such isolationism begin to unfold. Economies, once interconnected and thriving, crumble under the weight of closed borders and isolationist policies. Trade agreements collapse, industries falter, and technology falls behind as international cooperation grinds to a halt. The West, once a beacon of progress, has become a fractured land of paranoia, where fear has suffocated any hope for growth or innovation. But the isolation of the West is only part of the story. Inside these fortress nations, civil strife brews. The purges and restrictive laws have created a volatile undercurrent of resistance. In cities across Europe and North America, protests erupt, led by those who refuse to accept the narrative of replacement. The streets of Paris, Berlin, and New York are filled with angry crowds, waving signs that demand justice for the displaced, for the immigrants whose lives have been torn apart by government policies. Riots break out, and the response is swift and brutal. Militarized police forces crack down with tear gas and rubber bullets, determined to crush any sign of dissent. In some places, the tension escalates in a full-blown civil war. Believers, emboldened by their governments, form militias to patrol their neighborhoods, driving out anyone who doesn't fit their narrow vision of national identity. But the resistance is equally fierce. Ethnic minorities, immigrants, and their allies organize underground movements, fighting back with guerrilla tactics and sabotage. Cities become war zones, with bombings, assassinations, and street skirmishes tearing apart the social fabric. Once peaceful communities are divided into factions, each side convinced that they are fighting for their survival. The chaos isn't confined to the West. Countries in the developing world, once dependent on aid and trade from Europe and the United States, are left to fend for themselves as the global order disintegrates. Humanitarian crises multiply, with famine, disease, and displacement reaching unprecedented levels. The refugee flows that once concerned the West now swell to biblical proportions as millions of people flee war, poverty, and climate change. But the gates of the fortress remain closed, leaving these populations to wander in search of sanctuary that no longer exists. Ironically, even as believers celebrate their victory, the future they dread most begins to materialize before their eyes. The once proud nations they sought to defend have become hollowed-out shells, ravaged by economic collapse and social upheaval. The cultural homogeneity they fought for leads to stagnation, as innovation, creativity, and diversity of thought are stifled. Without the influx of new ideas and talent, industries falter, and the West loses its competitive edge on the global stage. The very collapse believers sought to prevent has now become their reality. They believed that by shutting out the world, they could preserve their way of life, but in doing so, they accelerated their decline. Their nations, once vibrant and diverse, are now suffocated by their own isolation. The future they fought so desperately to avoid, a dystopia of cultural and economic decay, has come to pass, not because of immigration, but because of the fear that drove them to reject it. For critics of the theory, the idea that nations must close themselves off to protect their identities is not only misguided but dangerous. They argue that the strength of nations lies not in their homogeneity, but in their diversity, the blending of cultures, ideas, and perspectives that drive innovation and progress. In this alternative vision of the future, nations open their borders not out of fear, but out of hope. Global cooperation becomes the cornerstone of policy, with countries working together to tackle the challenges of the modern world, climate change, economic inequality, and humanitarian crises. Rather than purging immigrants, these countries invest in integration programs that foster understanding and collaboration between different cultures. Dr. Maria Gomez, a leading voice in the movement for global unity, argues that the only way to prevent the dystopia feared by believers is through dialogue and inclusion. We must reject the narrative of fear and division, she says. Our future depends on our ability to come together, to learn from one another, and to build a world that is stronger because of its diversity, not in spite of it. In this future, the West thrives not as a fortress, but as a beacon of cooperation and progress. The walls come down, not just physically, but metaphorically, as people begin to see each other not as threats, but as partners in building a better world. It is a future where fear no longer dictates policy, and where the Great Replacement Theory is remembered not as a prophecy, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what can happen when we let fear control our destiny. The world, poised on the edge, has two paths before it. One leads to division, isolation, and collapse. The other offers hope, unity, and a future where all can thrive. The choice ultimately is ours.